This is Mina Frost, General Counsel for Sano Genetics, coming to you to talk to you today about some of the legal and ethical intricacies of the work that we do here at Sano. Sano is a platform that helps our clients with finding patients for precision medicine trials, for helping with genetic testing and identification of biomarkers, as well as long-term patient engagement and analytics. Sano has a steeped history in working with biotech and pharmaceuticals, as well as academic institutions, and has become an expert in precision medicine and identifying patients for trials. I am a healthcare attorney and have been for 20 years. As you can tell from my accent, I am from the US originally, but have been living in the UK for the last 15 years. I have experience working in law firms with lots of different kinds of healthcare clients, specifically with two of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world, specifically Abbott Laboratories and GlaxoSmithKline. I was the chief privacy officer of both of those companies before I moved on to working in the digital health space, which I absolutely loved. It sort of introduced me to a different category of individual, some really cool technology components, and obviously the intersection of digital and healthcare can only be captured, I think, in the concept of genetics and the wonderful mystery that is that are our genes. And so I have been working with health tech clients for about 3 years now, and recently started as the general counsel for Sano Genetics. I am here to talk to you today about precision medicine and some of the fundamentals of precision medicine. I think a great place to start is sort of by defining what precision medicine is, in some ways through what it's not. A lot of us know clinical trials and drug discovery through traditional medicine, the classic white pill and how we find it, and the classic white pill being applicable to large populations of diseased individuals, working in exactly the same way, or intended to work in exactly the same way in all patients in which it's given. Unfortunately, I think traditional medicine has not always been as successful. I think on average, about half of the patients who receive a traditional medicine have it behave in their bodies the way that it's intended. And the difference between traditional medicine and precision medicine is that we get a bit more information when we talk about precision medicine. So we identify a disease population. We look at a companion diagnostic. Oftentimes that diagnostic is looking at genetic material and sequencing that genetic material to identify genetic variations or expressions or biomarkers that help us understand a little bit more how a medicine might behave in a disease population. It's hard to believe, but everybody with cancer, everybody with diabetes has lots of different variations happening within their body that will dictate whether or not a particular medicine is effective for them. So by collecting the genetic information and identifying the biomarkers, we can start to create subsets of disease population who may or may not interact with a medicine better or worse, depending on given those extra genetic factors. This allows scientists, pharmaceutical companies, medicine developers to think through how their medicine might work. In other words, be more targeted. So a medicine in one population may operate through a different modality than a medicine in a different population, albeit in the same broad disease population. So that's the difference between precision medicine and traditional medicine. And precision medicine these days is on the rise. Sometimes people call it personalized medicine. Oftentimes it's associated with unmet need populations where there isn't a lot of research or new medicines being developed, also called rare disease. but also more and more in the spaces like oncology, where historically our oncology medicines have been a trial and error of cocktails, where the patient is asked to endure side effects and in the hopes that it will be effective. I think with precision medicine, oncology medicines can become a lot more targeted, a lot more effective. Perhaps not without side effects, but with the added benefit of actually making a difference in the cancer expression. So that's been brilliant. I think that's probably a good starting point as far as the difference between traditional medicine and precision medicine. The way regulatory bodies view the difference is interesting. As you can imagine, the regulatory framework doesn't always keep up with advances in technology or in science as quickly as we'd like. However, organizations like the FDA in the US and organizations like the European Medicines Agency in Europe do have specific guidelines and thoughts around how precision medicines can be approved. Some of them can be fast-tracked, the same level of evidence is required. I think most importantly, however, because we're talking about medicines that are targeted for a specific population, often a smaller one, the post-monitoring surveillance is incredibly important to these agencies. How these specific medicines that are targeted for individuals operate and whether or not they're actually effective becomes incredibly important because we don't have a large population where a single medicine is being applied, and therefore we can look for safety signals. The post-monitoring surveillance of a precision medicine, I think, becomes even more important. Having said that, one of the biggest issues that comes up in the space of precision medicine and the process to getting a precision medicine to market is oftentimes how we deal with the patients themselves. There are so many different considerations when we think about how a patient might react to participation in a clinical trial for a precision medicine. Oftentimes, this individual has a disease that is significantly life-altering, and therefore is also already a vulnerable patient. They will have lots of things happening to them. And so it's incredibly important that as part of the precision medicine process, that when we are recruiting the patients that we need, that we consider both ethical and data privacy issues when dealing with the patient. From an ethical perspective, we are asking them to provide us with either saliva or a blood sample or sometimes tissue to test, to sequence, to extract genetic material and conduct an analysis on it. And that alone, just the giving of that sample, is often met with resistance among patients, and understandably so. Science is often a mystery if you don't fully grasp it. But these people are desperate to find medicines that will help them feel well again. And it's important that we balance that desire to participate in a clinical trial to improve their health and the risks and concerns and side effects and all of the good and bad things associated with a clinical trial, and make sure that they understand that. So that ethical consideration of bringing the patients along for the journey is very important. On top of that, these days, more and more people are very concerned about the privacy of their information, specifically their health information. And if we think about collecting saliva, blood, tissue to extract genetic material, we're talking about them sharing with us the most fundamental element of their body, which is their DNA. And it is the most identifiable because it is the most unique. And obviously the laws and regulations in this space are, again, yet to catch up around whether genetic material by itself, without any accompanying data, qualifies as personal data. But you can imagine from a patient's perspective that would actually feel deeply personal. to them, and therefore incredibly important for companies like Sano and others to ensure that they are feeling reassured about the information they're providing us. In the US, there's the US HIPAA law, and that protects health information. In the EU, we have the GDPR, which protects personal data with special protections accounted for sensitive personal data. There are also many countries around the world outside of the US and the EU who are enacting very, very stringent privacy protections for individuals, particularly with regard to their health information. So more and more, the world is coming online to the idea that privacy is a human right, and that individuals should feel like they have control of their own information. One of the most amazing and unique things about Sano that I have found is that we firmly believe that the patient is actually the owner of their personal data. And that whether we're helping to arbitrate that or between them and a pharmaceutical company who's running a clinical trial, whether we're running analytics on it or anonymously using that information to find trends and identify potential signals, at the end of the day and at the heart of it all is the patient, and they are the owners of their personal data. They have the control. And how they exercise that control is through consent. Obviously, if you work in this space, you are very familiar with the informed consent document. It contains a myriad of information, including what the trial is meant to do, the purpose of the clinical trial that they're participating in, what they will be asked to do as patients and participants within the trial. They will be told the risks of participation. They will be told their rights with regard to participation in the study. And probably most importantly, they will be asked to give permission to use, share, process, transcribe, transfer their information amongst a host of other parties for the benefit of the research. And I think it's incredibly critical that when we are talking to patients and sharing that information with patients, that we are as transparent as we possibly can be. I certainly, as a lawyer, have been guilty of talking in a different language, a highly technical vernacular, and oftentimes that doesn't resonate or land with individuals who are not so inclined, and therefore I think it's incumbent upon us to make sure that the patient has an understanding, not just that we're communicating clearly, but that actually there is a understanding on the other side of what is being asked of them and what will happen to not only their health information and health material, but also what happens to them post-trial. On top of the consent, there's also an incredibly important mechanism that Sano uses regardless of whether or not it's legally or regulatorily required. Oftentimes with clinical trials, specifically if you're investigating a medicinal product in particular, you will be required to have an institutional review board or an ethics committee review your protocol, your informed consent, all of your patient-facing documents to ensure that there's that transparency and plain language and understanding by the patient. I think regardless of whether we have an investigational product in a particular trial, Sano's practice is to put our trials before an ethics committee every single time. It's important to us to ensure that we have another pair of eyes on the protocol and what we're doing, often finding patients and screening them for a clinical trial. So not necessarily participation in a clinical trial, but rather in the research that's preparatory to that clinical trial. Despite not being legally required to have an ethics committee, it's always useful and helpful to have a second pair of eyes on the protocol to ensure that the patient is protected, not only from a physical safety perspective, but also from an informational safety perspective. Some of the other issues that are addressed in the process of getting an informed consent and getting ethics committee approval is looking at not only the clinical trial that's going to happen in the immediate timeline, but rather future uses of that genetic information or health information in other studies that may come subsequently. Specifically with genetic information, many of you will be familiar with a book about a woman called Henrietta Lacks, whose DNA was used to grow cell lines for research, but without her or her family's permission. It's an incredibly interesting story, but a really moving story as well. And it really highlights the ethical considerations of using genetic material in clinical research or clinical trials, and how we use and store, retain, and use that material in the future for future research, and whether we have the right permissions to do so. So as an individual, if I was a patient wanting to give informed consent for a particular trial, almost separately, or in another section of the informed consent, there has to be the ability for me to say whether or not I want to participate or have my information used in future research, and to ensure that there's transparency around that so that a patient is really making an informed decision. The legal and regulatory landscape around clinical research is complicated. It is varied across the world, and it requires a navigation through intricacies that are not always easy. The regulatory landscape often doesn't keep up with the science and the technology that's often deployed in clinical trials today, specifically with regard to precision medicine. But we know precision medicine is the future. And so we work with regulators, we work with ethical committees, we work with patients and advocacy groups to ensure that individuals are fully briefed before they participate in these precision medicine trials. But oftentimes the benefit of that is that we get patients that are specifically meant for a particular medicine, and we get better results, we get better outcomes, health outcomes for those patients. So precision medicine is the way forward. It is more nuanced, it is more driven by technology and information, and it results in better outcomes, health outcomes for individuals. But it does come with quite a few complicated legal and ethical issues that we have to navigate as well. If you want to learn more about precision medicine, please visit us at sanogenetics.com.